Alright, good morning everyone. Hope you all are having a good snow day. So just kind of go over the content we'll be covering chapter 3 today, Introduction to SQL. So some brief contents we'll be covering. We'll be starting off with a SQL overview, give a good little overview of some of the things you can do with SQL, that sort of thing. We'll talk about the data definition part of SQL. We'll cover the SQL Query Structure. So go through that and make sure that everyone understands the basics of SQL queries. Talk about some basic operations we may apply, some set operations, go over null values briefly. Not a whole lot to say about them, but we'll go over them. Aggregate functions, nested subqueries, as well as database modification. So just refresh. Hopefully, we've gone over this several times. Hopefully this is a review. But these are where we actually begin to use databases. So some terms of databases to know. First, you need to know what a table is. So a table, of course, being a collection of rows and columns, where columns, of course, are going to be our attributes in an ERD. But in this context, they're going to be our variables, what we're collecting. And then, of course, rows are going to be individual records. All right. Relations, of course, are going to be relations between two or more tables, I should say. Okay, of course we have primary key. They uniquely identify each row within inside of a table. And of course a foreign key is going to be where you have, most of the time it's going to be the primary key of another table existing in a table it doesn't originate in. Doesn't have to be a primary key in another table though. Don't get that confused. And then lastly, of course, you have composite key. So composite key is simply going to be a primary key that's comprised of two or more columns. So again, that should all be a review. Now, what we'll be covering today that's new, starting now, is data definition. So we've talked about data definition language, and we've also talked about the data markup language. Okay, so in this class, we're going to be focusing today on data definition language. And this has a lot of interesting components to it. So this is where we're allowed to specify not only each of the tables, we're allowed to specify the relations between those tables. So I have up there schema. Just think about that as you're programming in the relations between each of the tables. Okay, this is where you also specify what type of value you're going to have for each column. So for instance, if you have a column for ID, it's probably going to be an integer. If you have a column for name, it's probably going to be some sort of string, maybe a varchar, most likely a varchar. If you have a price of something, it's probably going to be a double or a float. Okay? So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about defining the types of values in each of the columns. Okay, we talked about this a little bit last class. Integrity constraints. So integrity constraints are going to allow us to specify, what we're requiring for something to be present. So for instance, let's say we have a foreign key. We want to make sure that it is in fact something that references something in a different table. Well, you could use an integrity constraint there. Another example of integrity constraint. Let's say that you had an address and you run it against the United States Postal Service's database and their API specifically to ensure that it's a legal address. It's making sure that it's spelled correctly, making sure that it's going to be consistent. Okay? Physical storage structure. We don't cover too much in here. That's more of a data structures topic. It's a pretty advanced class. I don't necessarily recommend it unless you really want to do data structures, but we can certainly specify that in the data definition. The good news is that any modern database server will allow you to handle that automatically. Okay, you don't have to be an expert on data, on any sort of storage structure or anything like that. Data structures, you don't have to know all that. All right, so I'm not going to cover it too much. And then lastly, the security and authorization for each of the relations, but not just relations. Also, the individual tables themselves, and certainly the individual columns. Okay, so you can certainly specify that only certain roles can access certain columns. You can also, of course, provide users with stuff like windows. Okay, I don't mean Windows the operating system. I mean you provide them with a predefined window of you can access these things in this way. And we'll cover that as we go on to some of the more advanced chapters. All right, just a brief review again of data types. So we have char. So char is, of course, going to be fixed length. So it doesn't have to have everything with that exact length. However, you can't extend beyond it, obviously. And if you do have something that doesn't include the full length, it's going to be filled in with most likely zeros. Okay, so you're going to specify the length there. That contrasts with varchar. So with varchar, obviously it's variable length. You're not going to have the missing characters filled in with anything. They're just going to be present. All right, and then of course you have int. So integer obviously is going to be a whole number, and basically it's just going to allow you to use whole numbers as opposed to having a decimal point. Some advantages, there's some disadvantages. Most of the time, like I say, for stuff like IDs, for stuff it's going to be always a whole number, probably going to use int. Small int you're probably not likely to use. There may be a couple cases where you would, but for the most part, you're not likely to use small int. You're most likely going to stick to int. So numeric, we're not going to do too much with numeric, but basically just understand that the first digit, the first, so it says P there, all right, that's going to be how many total digits. And then the comma D, that's where the decimal point goes. So make sure you pay close attention to that on there. If you have 3, 1, you can't have anything more than 3 total digits. That includes the decimal place. All right. So of course you also have doubles and floats. So I'll leave that up to you. Now this is where it gets kind of interesting. Because up to this point we've talked about data. We've talked about what we do. We haven't talked about how we do it in terms of making a SQL database. This is a basic schema definition. Okay, the create function is what we're going to primarily use for most, if not all, of this information here. All right, so we're using create table, table name, column 1, data type. Okay, so like I said, start off with create, tell it what you're creating. In this case, we're creating a table, so we specify table. Now, a quick little aside, the textbook doesn't specify that everything should be uppercase if it's a SQL function or operator. I think it should. So for this class, make sure you do that. But again, what you're doing, using create function, telling it what you're creating, a table, you're naming the table, opening up a parentheses, then you put in all of your columns, separate them out by a comma, and obviously you also have to specify the data type, just use a space for that. So for instance, if I wanted to use column 1 is student ID, I'd say student ID, and then I'd say like int. Okay, then comma, then maybe fname, maybe varchar, maybe 15, comma, so on and so forth. And then once you've done all that, you specified all the columns, make sure you specify the primary key as well as any foreign keys you may have. So you just do that below and close out your parentheses, put your good friend the semicolon at the end, and run it. You've created your first table. So I'm going to briefly check on the comments, just make sure that everyone can hear everything okay. Give me just a second. I don't see any comments, so I'm assuming everything's all right. All right, so some schema definition tips. Like I say, specify the primary key, specify the foreign key. For the foreign key, you're very likely going to use references, so it references something else. And that's an option that you're going to have at the very bottom. So right here after primary key, you're going to have any foreign keys you may have, as well as what they reference. You can also add constraints, as well as you can add not null. So you can actually do not null after any of the data types. So you would say like student ID, int, and then not null, comma. Okay, that's how you would do that. Now we're going to see a lot more examples the next couple of classes. I've booked out about 3 weeks to work on SQL. Okay, so we're going to have plenty of time to see examples. This is just kind of going over the theory today. All right. And also, with primary keys, it's implied they can't be null. So while you can specify that a primary key is not null, you don't have to, because it's primary key. It has to be not null. All right, so we talked about create. We're going to go through these others kind of briefly, and we'll go through them a little bit more detail as we go. But this is going to be the 5 primary SQL functions that we're going to use. Obviously, we're using a lot more, but these are the 5 main ones. Okay, so insert. That's going to allow us to insert new records into a table, or also insert basically just insert new stuff. Okay, doesn't have to be into a table. Can be into a specific column if you so chose. Update, obviously that allows you to modify existing tables or records. Delete, as the name would imply, that allows you to delete existing records. And finally, drop. So drop is going to allow you to remove tables, schema, higher level things basically. Okay, so the general query structure we're going to have. Okay, just doing a basic select statement. Start it off with select. That's going to return whatever you tell it to. And of course you tell it to immediately after select. You say select, and you can use the star, which is acting as the wildcard, so it's an asterisk. And it's going to return everything in whatever columns, or not whatever columns, in whatever tables you specify. Okay, so you can also say select student ID, comma, first name from student. You can do that as well. Okay, so you start with select, tell it what you're wanting to select, and then say where you're getting it from in the from. Okay, so that's what you do in a nutshell, basically. So this order of functions is vital. All right, write this down, take notes on it somehow, because this is what will help you probably more than anything else when it comes to writing basic queries. It's just understanding the order of things. Okay, so you start off with select, and then you say where you're selecting from. That's the from. The where is where you can specify inclusion or exclusion based on your criteria. Okay, group by is going to be used, obviously, to have the results grouped by some grouping variable. So, for instance, let's say that we had sales for the whole world, and we wanted to have them broken down by region. Okay, we could say group by region, and what that will do is that will then group all of the results by region. So we're going to have all of our regions broken down. And whatever we chose to select, be it just a raw variable, be it a sum, be it a max, min, that sort of thing, it's going to be broken down. And we'll see examples of that. All right, having is going to be very similar to where, only it allows us to use aggregate functions. That's the only difference, really. Make sure you understand that. That's a very important concept, because you'll get to the point where you want to say, select from this table, and you'll think where the max is this. You can't do the where max. You have to do having max. Okay? A little bit complicated, but not too bad. And then lastly, order by. That allows you to sort the observations. Maybe you want to do order by some column, and then you can specify either ascend or descend. So for ascend in most SQL implementations, that's going to be ASC. In descend, obviously that's going to be DESC. Okay? And you can also order by multiple columns. Okay, lots of different things you can do with order by. So, and I'll also make note, you don't have to have every single one of these. Most of the time, you're not going to have all 6 of these. But if you do have all 6, this is the order they must be in. Okay, so you have to have them in this specific order. Otherwise, you'll run into a lot of issues. All right, so you can also do SQL Math Operations. Where can you do SQL Math Operations? Well, 2 main places. Obviously, you can do it in select, and obviously you can do it in having. Okay, so you could do select to, let's say, price times quantity from inventory, for instance. You could do that. That's totally cool. Okay, you could do price plus tax. You know, there's no limitation to what you can do with these math operators. Okay. So the basic ones we have here, obviously we have addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Okay, we also of course have the ampersand, which is of course going to be the mod operator. So as opposed to doing division where it's going to leave you with a decimal, it basically just leaves you with the remainder, okay, in effect. It's the mod operator. Of course you also have and of course you also have the or, and then you have the exclusive or. So the ampersand is obviously the and, the or symbol is obviously the or, and then of course the caret is not referring in this context to exponential, as you may have guessed. It's the exclusive or. And we've talked about exclusive or, so I don't need to go too much into that. But I think everyone understands that these math operators are what we're going to use for a lot of the cool stuff. And I'll also make note, and like I said, we'll see examples as we go in the next couple weeks. But what's really cool is we can take these math operators and then we can use the as modifier to then cast that as a new variable name. So let's say that we wanted to go back to the example where we took price and multiplied it by quantity. We can cast that with as, and we can say as value or something like that. Okay, so it's pretty useful stuff and certainly very cool and interesting to see. All right, so some string operations. Okay, these are obviously for math. Okay, so you're using numbers. Okay, string operations are also important. All right, so you can concatenate two strings using basically two or symbols there. You can of course also use the %, and that's going to match the entire substring, or you can use the underscore to match any character within the substring. So we'll see examples of some of these string operations. They're pretty useful as well. Regular expression, we could spend a whole day talking about regular expression. All right, it's a very complicated function with many different modifiers we can apply. Just a very powerful tool. All right, so where? So while we can't do aggregate functions with where, we can certainly specify many other things. Okay, so we could do comparisons inside of where. So for instance, if we had the between, okay, we can use the between modifier here, and we can say where salary is between 90,000 and 100,000. And let's say we forgot that we have between. Okay, obviously we can also use regular comparisons. So we can say salary less than equal to 100,000 and salary greater than equal to 90,000. So a couple different options we have there. We also have set operators. We're not going to talk too much about these because there's other ways to do this stuff as well that I think is a little bit easier to understand. But the idea here is with a union, okay, you're taking two or more results and you're putting them into a single set. So if you think about a Venn diagram, all right, think about the two things, the union's in the middle, all right? And one of the cool things is unless you use a union all, okay, if you just use a regular union, it's not going to have any duplicates. So that's a very beneficial thing to have. All right, then next we have intersect. Okay, so intersect is going to take data from both of the results sets, and it's going to also, unless we use intersect all, it's also going to only take the non-repeating stuff. Okay, I shouldn't say the non-repeating stuff. It's going to remove stuff that repeats. Okay, so you're going to have everything once, but not everything multiple times. Okay, that's a better way to phrase it. All right, and then of course you have except. So that's where you're using data from the first set, not the second set. Now this is covered a lot more detail in chapter 4, where you start to do basic joins. Okay, so joins are where we're going to do a lot of this stuff. Okay, so this is just kind of understanding the theory behind it, though. All right, null values, that's pretty straightforward. If something's not there, okay, it's null. Another word for null, of course, is missing. All right, and the main use of this is saying, is null. Okay, so you're just using the null modifier to see what is missing. That's a pretty useful thing if you're wanting to see what is missing and do operations based on it. But for the most part, it's not going to be something you're going to be using a whole lot. Well, I shouldn't say you're not going to be using it a whole lot. You're not going to be using it for much more than that. Okay, that's a better way to phrase that. All right, aggregate functions. So aggregate, of course, being combination of things. So you take multiple observations and you aggregate them. All right. This either happens in select or it happens in having. So we take AVG. Obviously, that's going to be the average. Okay, so we take average, open up a parentheses, type in your variable name, close parentheses. That's going to give you the average of that variable. Now, one cool thing is you can combine this with group by. So let's say you take the average sales. You select average sales. Okay, so you say AVG, open parentheses, sale, close parentheses, from whatever table it's in. And then you would say, of course, group by, and then say region, or whatever your region variable is. And then you would say having, and you could do all these things. So lots of cool things we can do here. All right, min, max, sum, count. I don't think I need to go over those in great detail. I'll just run through them. Minimum's going to return the minimum value. Maximum's obviously going to return the maximum value. Sum is going to provide you with a sum of all the records that meet the criteria that you specify in the rest of the SQL statement. And count is obviously going to return how many things there are that meet those criteria. All right, modifying a database. You don't make a database once and you're done. Okay, if that were the case, there wouldn't be much of a reason to really learn databases. So yeah, what we do is we modify them. All right, so we modify them in many ways. All right, one way is obviously to use delete. So when you use delete, it allows you to delete certain records from a table. All right, insert is obviously going to allow you to add records to a table. So a lot of times you may do insert into. Now, one cool thing is that you can also do select into to select into a new table. And that's useful for a lot of different reasons. We'll talk about that as we go on in this semester. All right, update. That's going to allow us to, of course, modify existing records. All right, that one's a dangerous one, okay, because if someone modifies something that's not supposed to be modified, that could certainly lead to some problems for an organization. And then, of course, drop is going to allow you to drop certain tables, so literally take them out of the database altogether. All right, so we've gone over the basics of SQL. What I want you all to do is working with your partner or working independently. It's really up to you all, however you want to do it. Basically, I want everyone to come to class on Tuesday with SQL create statements from the database that we've been working on in class. So, like I say, if you need help with that, I unfortunately will not really be able to help much this week, but I will be hopefully on campus next week. Basically, my suggestion is go on W3 School's website, look at the SQL, and then sort of look and see how they do the create statements. So all you're doing is just providing create statements for the database that you've been working on. So you're going to have all your different tables, each having a create statement. You're going to go ahead and handle things like foreign keys. You're going to handle basically everything. Okay? So that's what your assignment is. Make sure you have that ready by class time on Tuesday. Just kind of wrap things up. We talked about SQL just at a very high level. Talked about data definition. Talked about the query structure of different queries we may run. Talked about some basic operations, some set operations, how to handle null values, aggregate functions, as well as database modification. So that's all I've got for today. Like I said, don't forget to do the homework assignment here, and I will see you all hopefully on Tuesday. Have a great week, everyone.